Did the palace really just confirm something it usually spends days denying? That's the question people froze on when the alert flashed across screens. Not a rumor, not a tabloid whisper, not an unnamed source speaking on background. This time, the confirmation came from the British royal family itself, carefully worded, emotionless on the surface, and yet, somehow, devastating. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. 2 minutes ago, those words alone were enough to send shockwaves through social media, newsrooms, and group chats around the world. Because when the palace confirms anything involving Prince Harry, history tells us it's never casual, it's never accidental, and it's never simple. So pause for a second. Ask yourself this. When was the last time the royal family spoke quickly? Not eventually. Not after monitoring the situation. Not after days of silence. Quickly. That's why this moment feels different. Heavy, loaded, unavoidable. The alert didn't give many details. In fact, that might be the most unsettling part. It didn't need to. The word devastating did all the work. And when institutions that survive on understatement choose language like that, it's never random. Here's what most people don't realize. The royal family doesn't confirm developing situations unless 3 things are already happening behind the scenes. 1. The story is about to break whether they like it or not. 2. Silence would do more damage than speaking. And 3. The internal consequences of delay are worse than the public consequences of disclosure. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What forced their hand this time? Because if this were just another headline cycle, the palace would have waited. They always do. They let the press speculate. They let the narrative exhaust itself. They let time do the work. But not today. Today, they moved first. And that alone should tell you how serious this is. Now let's talk about why the phrase car crash accident hits differently when attached to this family. You already know why. Everyone does, even if they don't want to say it out loud. Certain words carry historical weight. They don't exist in isolation. They echo. They reopen emotional files people thought were closed. And for Prince Harry, that echo has always followed him. Publicly, he spent years trying to step out from under the shadow of tragedy. Privately, that shadow never leaves. You don't grow up inside an institution shaped by loss without internalizing how fragile everything is. So when people saw his name next to those words, reactions weren't logical. They were visceral. Fear came first, then confusion, then anger. And then, almost immediately, suspicion. Because audiences today don't just consume news. They interrogate it. They ask what's missing. They compare wording. They look for patterns. And right away, people notice something strange. The confirmation was short. Too short. No location details. No timeline. No emotional framing beyond that single loaded adjective. No reassurance language. No further updates will be provided. Just confirmation. And silence. Why does that matter? Because the palace has a script for everything, including emergencies, including health scares, including incidents involving senior figures. Those scripts usually follow a rhythm. Acknowledge, minimize panic, promise updates, emphasize stability. This statement didn't do that. Instead, it felt restrained, controlled, almost like it was designed to say the bare minimum necessary to get ahead of something bigger. So let's slow down and break this apart. When the royal family uses the word devastating, it isn't describing public reaction. It's describing internal impact. They don't speak for the crowd. They speak for the institution. That word tells us how the event landed inside palace walls. And if it landed that hard, then something about this situation disrupted the usual sense of control. Think about how rare that is. This is an institution that survived abdications, scandals, wars, divorces, global scrutiny, and generational shifts. It doesn't panic easily. It doesn't rush easily. So what changed the equation? One possibility is timing. Another is pressure. A third is information that was about to surface without their consent. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because the palace doesn't just manage news. It manages perception. It decides when stories are framed as private family matters versus public concerns. And once it crosses that line, it can't go back. This confirmation crossed that line. Which means the palace decided that pretending this was purely private would no longer hold. Now ask yourself this. What kind of situation makes privacy impossible? Not every incident does. In fact, Most don't. There have been countless moments involving royals that never received official acknowledgement at all. They faded quietly. They were handled discreetly. This wasn't one of those moments. And that's why people aren't just asking what happened. They're asking why now. Why speak at this exact moment? Why use that exact language? Why not wait? Those questions are already reshaping the narrative, whether the palace likes it or not. And here's another detail people are overlooking. The confirmation didn't center Harry as a public figure. It centered the situation as a family matter with institutional implications. That distinction matters, because it tells us who the message was really for. Not the tabloids, not social media, but other stakeholders. Governments, security partners, media organizations already holding information. In other words, this wasn't just about informing the public. It was about drawing a boundary before others crossed it. Now let's talk about why this story matters beyond headlines. Prince Harry has always existed at the intersection of public fascination and institutional tension. He's not just a person. He's a symbol. To some, he represents escape. To others, betrayal. To others still, vulnerability in a system that prides itself on control. So when something destabilizing happens to him, it doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward. It forces conversations the palace would rather postpone. Conversations about responsibility, about protection, about whether the institution truly shields those inside it, or simply manages the fallout when things go wrong. That's why this confirmation is being described as devastating, not just concerning. Because it threatens more than one narrative at once. It threatens the idea that distance equals safety. It threatens the belief that stepping away reduces risk. And it threatens the palace's ability to frame events on its own terms. Now let me ask you something directly. Did you notice how fast the reactions escalated? Within minutes, speculation exploded. Within an hour, narratives hardened. Some sympathetic, some accusatory, some openly distrustful. That doesn't happen unless people feel like they've seen this movie before. And that's another reason this moment is dangerous for the royal family. Public memory is long. People remember patterns. They remember past delays, past denials, past statements that were later revised. So when the palace speaks quickly, it creates a paradox. Speed suggests seriousness, but it also invites scrutiny. People aren't asking whether the statement is true. They're asking what it's preparing us for. Because confirmations like this are rarely endpoints. They're openings. They create space for further disclosures. They signal that something is already in motion. And once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of all. The palace didn't try to reassure. There was no language about stability, no emphasis on continuity, no mention of routine. And when institutions omit reassurance, it's usually because reassurance would ring hollow. That doesn't automatically mean the worst, but it does mean uncertainty is real. And uncertainty is the one thing the royal family hates more than bad press. Why? Because uncertainty can't be managed with protocol alone. It invites questions. It invites investigation. It invites comparisons to moments they'd rather not revisit. Moments involving silence. Moments involving delay. Moments involving consequences. And standing behind all of this, watching carefully, is King Charles III. Not just as a monarch, but as a father. Every crisis involving Prince Harry collapses those two roles into one. The crown and the family collide. Duty and emotion intersect. And history tells us those intersections are rarely smooth. So when people ask why this confirmation feels heavier than usual, that's why. It's not just about what happened. It's about who is affected. It's about what can no longer be controlled. And it's about what might come next. Because here's the truth most headlines won't tell you. The most important information hasn't been released yet. It's not in the confirmation. It's not in the early reports. It's not even in the speculation. It's hidden in the choices the palace made before speaking. The timing, the language, the restraint. Those are clues. And when you line them up, they suggest that this story isn't at its peak yet. It's at its beginning. Something forced the royal family to move faster than it ever wants to. Something made silence impossible. And something about this situation threatens to spill beyond what a single confirmation can contain. Because if this were truly simple, they would have waited. They didn't. And that means what comes next may be far more complicated than anyone is prepared for. But the real question isn't what the palace said. It's what they were trying to get ahead of. And that answer is where this story truly begins. Why did that single sentence feel heavier than an entire press conference? That's the question people keep circling back to. Because the moment the palace confirmed the news, something shifted. Not just in the headlines. In the tone. In the air. In the way people stopped scrolling and started reading every word twice. This wasn't noise. It was signal. And it all hinged on one phrase. The phrase that changed everything. When the British royal family confirmed the incident, they didn't ramble. They didn't contextualize. They didn't soften the edges. They chose precision. Surgical, almost cold precision. And that's exactly why the statement landed like a punch to the chest. Because the palace doesn't waste words. It selects them like tools. And every tool has a purpose. So let's slow this down. If you followed royal communications for any length of time, you already know the pattern. When something breaks involving a senior figure, the first statement usually does one of three things. It reassures, it delays, or it deflects. This one did none of the above. No reassurance language. No emphasis on stability. No suggestion that everything was under control. Instead, it acknowledged the situation and stepped back. Why does that matter? Because acknowledgement without reassurance is a rare move. It signals that the institution doesn't yet have control of the narrative. Or worse, that it knows control isn't possible. Now ask yourself this. When has the palace ever admitted something before shaping it? Almost never. Which means this wasn't about storytelling. It was about timing. And timing is everything in royal crises. The phrase itself was deceptively simple, clean, neutral. But the emotional weight didn't come from what it said. It came from what it didn't. No location. No sequence of events. No framing of severity. No promise of updates. Just confirmation. That's it. And that's exactly why people panicked. Because confirmation is what you do when denial is no longer an option. Here's something most casual viewers don't realize. The palace monitors news cycles in real time. Not just British media, but international outlets, wire services, and digital platforms. They know when a story is about to jump from speculation to inevitability. And when they speak early, it's usually because someone else is about to speak first. So who was that someone? Was it a media outlet holding verified information? Was it emergency services? Was it a third party with no loyalty to royal protocol? The palace isn't just reacting to events. It's reacting to information flow. And this time, the flow was moving too fast. That brings us to the second layer of this phrase. Why did it feel final? Not final as in irreversible. Final as in serious. The palace has dozens of ways to soften a story. They can emphasize minor injuries. They can stress precautionary measures. They can focus on routine medical checks or procedural follow-ups. They didn't. They chose gravity. And when institutions built on continuity choose gravity, it's because something has disrupted the sense of normal progression. Now let's talk about context. Because context is where this phrase becomes explosive. Any story involving Prince Harry carries emotional baggage. That's not opinion. That's reality. His life has unfolded in public view, shaped by loss, scrutiny, and a constant tug-of-war between personal agency and institutional expectation. So when his name appears in a confirmation like this, people don't read it neutrally. They read it through memory, through images they wish they could forget, through patterns they wish weren't repeating. And the palace knows that. Which means the decision to confirm wasn't just logistical. It was psychological. They knew exactly how the public would react. They knew fear would spike. They knew comparisons would be drawn. They knew old wounds would reopen. So why proceed anyway? Because whatever was coming next was worse than the reaction to confirmation itself. That's the uncomfortable truth. Institutions don't choose short-term panic unless long-term silence is more dangerous. Think about that. What could possibly be more dangerous than global panic? Loss of credibility, loss of authority, loss of narrative control. And that's what was on the line. Let's zoom out for a moment. Royal statements aren't written for emotion. They're written for record. Every word is designed to hold up under scrutiny, reinterpretation, and historical review. This statement wasn't crafted to calm hearts. It was crafted to establish a factual baseline, a line in the sand. From this point forward, the palace can say, "We acknowledged it early," which tells us they're already thinking ahead. Ahead to questions, ahead to investigations, ahead to revisions. Now here's where the contradictions begin. The palace acknowledged seriousness, but avoided specificity. Why? Because specificity creates accountability. Once you name locations, timelines, or conditions, you lock yourself into a version of events. And if new information emerges, revisions become admissions. So instead, they stayed abstract, serious enough to justify speaking, vague enough to allow movement later. That balancing act tells us the situation is still evolving. And evolving situations terrify institutions like this. Because evolution means unpredictability. And unpredictability breaks protocol. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Why does a car crash involving Prince Harry feel different from any other news story? Because this family doesn't just have history with tragedy. It has unfinished business with it. Publicly, the monarchy has moved forward. Privately, it has never fully escaped the shadow of past losses. Those memories inform decisions, reactions, and risk tolerance. So when this incident occurred, it didn't land in a vacuum. It collided with decades of institutional trauma. And that collision forced speed. Speed in confirmation. Speed in internal coordination. Speed in communication with external partners. Because delay would have amplified the parallels everyone was already drawing. And here's the part that should really make you pause. The palace didn't deny anything. That alone is telling. Denial is their most common first move. Even partial denial. Even soft denial. Even we cannot confirm reports at this time. They skipped that step entirely, which suggests the facts were already verified beyond reasonable doubt. Now ask yourself another uncomfortable question. If the facts were verified quickly, who verified them? And how? Because confirmation requires confidence. Confidence requires access. And access means information was flowing into the palace faster than usual. That doesn't happen unless multiple channels are active at once. Emergency services, security teams, local authorities, medical professionals. When those channels light up simultaneously, the palace has to respond. And respond it did, but not with comfort, with acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is the first domino. Once it falls, the rest follow. Public scrutiny intensifies. Media analysis deepens. Questions multiply. And the palace knows this, which means they've already accepted that this story won't stay contained. So why try to contain it at all? Because there's still something they're trying to protect. Something bigger than a headline. Something tied to perception, responsibility, and future implications. This is where the phrase becomes more than language. It becomes strategy. By confirming early, the palace positions itself as transparent, responsible, engaged. That positioning matters when harder questions arrive. Questions like, who was responsible for security? Were protocols followed? Could this have been prevented? Why was he there? Who knew what and when? Those questions are coming, and the palace is preparing for them. But here's the twist most people aren't seeing yet. This confirmation wasn't just about the incident. It was about redefining the boundaries of responsibility. Prince Harry exists in a complicated space. No longer a working royal, still a royal figure. Independent, yet inseparable from the institution's image. So when something goes wrong, responsibility becomes blurred. And blurred responsibility is dangerous. By confirming the incident, the palace implicitly re-enters the frame. It says, this matters to us, which raises the stakes. Because once you claim relevance, you invite accountability. And accountability is where this story gets uncomfortable. Now think about how quiet everything went after the statement. No follow-up, no clarification, no secondary messaging, just silence. That silence isn't absence. It's containment. The palace is watching reactions, tracking narratives, mapping fault lines, waiting to see which version of the story gains traction. And depending on that, the next move will change. Because there will be a next move. There always is. The only question is when, and what it will reveal. Because confirmations like this are never endpoints. They're thresholds. Once crossed, you can't go back to pretending this was minor. And the palace knows it. Which is why insiders describe moments like this as devastating. Not because of what's already happened, but because of what can no longer be stopped. The phrase changed everything because it forced the story into the open before the palace was fully ready. It acknowledged seriousness without offering closure. It invited attention. That's the question sitting just beneath the surface now. Because once you accept that the confirmation wasn't voluntary, everything about this story changes. This stops being a simple acknowledgement and starts looking like a response under pressure. Pressure from where? That's where things get complicated. The palace never reacts to noise. It reacts to inevitability. And inevitability only arrives when information escapes the channels they control, when facts start moving faster than protocol, when silence becomes a liability instead of a shield. So let's talk about why silence suddenly became impossible. Behind every royal statement is a risk calculation. Not emotional, not moral, strategic. The palace asks one central question before speaking. Will saying nothing cause more damage than saying something incomplete? Most of the time, the answer is no. Silence works. Rumors burn out. Attention shifts. Another headline replaces the last. But this time, silence was dangerous. Why? Because this story wasn't staying contained. Within minutes of the incident, multiple systems would have activated at once. Emergency responders, security teams, local authorities, medical personnel. Each of those systems operates independently. Each generates records. Each involves people who do not answer to royal protocol. And that's where control starts to slip. You can manage journalists. You can manage aides. You cannot manage paramedics, doctors, or police reports in the same way. Once those wheels are turning, information leaks don't happen out of malice. They happen because humans talk. They brief colleagues. They flag unusual cases. They document anomalies. And when the name Prince Harry enters that ecosystem, anonymity disappears. Now imagine the palace watching this unfold in real time. Alerts coming in. Phones lighting up. Security liaisons reporting movement. Media monitoring teams seeing unusual spikes in keyword searches. At that point, the palace isn't deciding whether to speak. It's deciding when. And when they choose early, it's because they know something else is coming soon. Something they won't be able to stop. Here's where the contradiction deepens. If the situation were straightforward, silence would have worked. Straightforward situations don't generate chaos. They don't generate competing narratives. They don't generate urgency across unrelated systems. This did, which suggests complexity. Not necessarily catastrophe, but complication. And complication is the enemy of controlled messaging. Now let's examine another uncomfortable angle. Why didn't the palace wait for full clarity? Because waiting implies confidence. And confidence implies time. They didn't have time. That tells us that external timelines were already forming. Timelines the palace couldn't slow down. Think about it. Media outlets don't all move at the same speed. Some sit on stories. Some verify for hours. Some publish the moment they can confirm a single detail. If even one credible outlet was minutes away from publishing a verified report, the palace had two options: get ahead of it, or lose control entirely. They chose to get ahead, but they did it in the narrowest way possible, which means they weren't trying to own the story. They were trying to anchor it. An anchor doesn't stop movement. It sets a reference point. By confirming the incident, the palace established a baseline. Anything reported after would be judged against that confirmation. Deviations would be questioned. Exaggerations could be dismissed. It's a defensive move. And defensive moves tell you someone feels cornered. Now ask yourself this. Why would the palace feel cornered over an incident involving a non-working royal? Because Prince Harry is non-working in title only. In reality, his existence still reflects on the institution. Every crisis involving him becomes a referendum on the monarchy's reach, responsibility, and relevance. And this incident landed at a particularly sensitive moment. Public trust in institutions is fragile. Media skepticism is high. Audiences are trained to question official narratives. So the palace couldn't afford to look evasive. Not now. Which brings us to another key pressure point. Timing. This didn't happen during a slow news week. It didn't happen when attention was scattered. It happened when global media ecosystems were already primed to amplify. In moments like that, silence doesn't create calm. It creates suspicion. And suspicion hardens faster than facts. So the palace moved. But not boldly. Carefully. And careful movement under pressure often signals internal disagreement. Some voices would have argued to wait. Others would have warned of reputational fallout. Somewhere in that tension, a compromise was reached. Confirm the bare minimum. Say enough to avoid accusations of concealment. Say little enough to preserve flexibility. That compromise is what you saw. Now let's talk about the human side of this decision. Because institutions don't act alone. People do. And standing at the center of this storm is King Charles III. not just as a monarch, as a father navigating an impossible position. Every decision involving Prince Harry forces him to balance two identities: the head of state and the parent of a son who has lived much of his life under extraordinary strain. When incidents happen, that tension sharpens. Do you speak as the crown? Do you speak as family? Do you speak at all? In this case, the answer was yes, but only just, and that tells us something important. This decision wasn't purely bureaucratic. It was emotional, not emotional in language, emotional in urgency, because when family is involved, the cost of delay feels different. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Speaking early creates expectations. The moment the palace confirmed the incident, it created an implicit promise that more information would follow, that clarity would come, that uncertainty would eventually be resolved. And if that promise isn't met, trust erodes. So now the palace is locked into a trajectory. They can't simply go silent forever, which means they're waiting for something, waiting for stabilization, waiting for confirmation, waiting for alignment across channels. And while they wait, speculation fills the gap. That's the risk they accepted. Why accept it? Because the alternative was worse. Now consider this. What if the palace didn't just react to one source, but multiple? What if emergency information, media verification, and third-party confirmations converged simultaneously? That kind of convergence triggers panic inside controlled systems. Because once multiple independent confirmations exist, denial becomes impossible. At that point, the best you can do is acknowledge and brace, which is exactly what this felt like. Acknowledgement. Brace. Now think about how this plays out long-term. Once a story reaches this stage, it stops being about the event itself. It becomes about handling. Every move forward will be judged not just on facts, but on tone, timing, transparency, and the palace knows it. That's why the initial confirmation was stripped of emotion. Emotion invites interpretation. Interpretation invites backlash. Instead, they chose restraint. But restraint under pressure always leaves fingerprints. People sense it. That's why audiences reacted so intensely. They didn't just hear the words. They felt the hesitation behind them. They sensed the calculation. And that makes people uneasy. Because when institutions hesitate, it suggests uncertainty at the top. Now let's bring this back to the central question. Who forced the palace to speak? The answer isn't a single person or outlet. It's the collision of systems. Emergency response systems that don't wait for permission. Media systems that reward speed. Public systems that demand transparency. And internal systems stretched between duty and fear. That collision created a moment where silence was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. And when silence becomes dangerous, institutions speak. Even when they're not ready. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because speaking early doesn't end scrutiny. It invites it. Now journalists will dig deeper. Analysts will dissect language. Insiders will leak context. Audiences will demand updates. And the palace will be forced to respond again. But the next response won't be optional. It will be reactive. And reactive statements are far harder to control. So the question isn't whether more information is coming. It's what kind. Will it clarify? Will it complicate? Will it contradict? And perhaps most importantly, will it expose something the palace hoped would never be discussed publicly? Because once you cross the line of confirmation, you open doors you can't fully close. And whatever forced the palace to speak this time hasn't finished exerting pressure yet. It's still moving, still unfolding, still threatening to pull more details into the light. And when that happens, this first confirmation will be remembered not as reassurance, but as the moment the palace realized it was already behind. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? That's the uncomfortable question hanging over everything now. Because the moment this story broke, it stopped being just about an incident. It became about memory, about history, about a shadow that has followed one man and one family for decades. You could feel it in the public reaction almost immediately. People didn't just react with concern. They reacted with dread. Why? Because for Prince Harry, the words car crash don't exist in isolation. They're not neutral. They don't arrive without context. They arrive carrying weight, trauma, and unresolved fear, both his own and the public's. And the palace knows that better than anyone. This is why the confirmation hit so hard. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it reawakened. Let's be honest with each other for a moment. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many new narratives are built, there are certain events that never fully fade from collective memory. They sit there, dormant, until something triggers them again. And this was a trigger. You could see it in the way headlines were written, in the careful phrasing, in the pauses broadcasters took before speaking his name, in the way commentators lowered their voices, almost instinctively. This wasn't just reporting. It was reverence mixed with fear. Because everyone understands one brutal truth. Prince Harry's relationship with loss was forged early, publicly, and permanently. And that history changes how every new crisis is interpreted. Now here's where the contradiction begins. For years, Harry has tried to redefine himself outside the institution, to escape the constant replay of his childhood trauma, to build a life where he isn't forever framed by what he lost, but by what he chooses. And yet, moments like this remind us how fragile that separation really is. You can leave the institution. You can reject its rules. You can create distance. But you can't outrun history, especially when the public refuses to let it go. So when this confirmation dropped, people didn't just ask, "What happened?" They asked, "Is this happening again?" That question alone explains the intensity of the response. Because repetition is terrifying, and repetition is exactly what people fear most. Now pause and think about how unfair that is. One individual becomes symbolically linked to tragedy so tightly that every incident is filtered through the same lens. Every risk feels amplified. Every unknown feels ominous. That's not logic. That's trauma. Collective trauma. And the palace knows it has to navigate that terrain carefully. Because mishandling a moment like this doesn't just create backlash. It creates emotional damage. This is where the internal debate becomes critical. Do you acknowledge the public's fear? Or do you try to suppress it by minimizing the story? Either choice has consequences. Acknowledgement can inflame panic. Minimization can feel like erasure. And with Harry, erasure has always been the accusation. For years, critics have said the institution never truly protected him. That it prioritized optics over well-being. That it treated vulnerability as inconvenience. Whether you believe that or not, those accusations exist. And moments like this bring them roaring back. So when the palace confirmed the incident, it wasn't just responding to facts. It was responding to a narrative it has never fully controlled. A narrative about a boy who lost his mother in front of the world. A narrative about unresolved grief. A narrative about institutional failure. And that's why this moment is so dangerous. Because it invites people to connect dots the palace would rather keep separate. Now let's talk about Prince Harry himself. Publicly, he's often framed as defiant, angry, rebellious, someone who walked away. Privately, those close to him have always described something else. Hypervigilance, an acute awareness of risk, a fear of repetition. You don't live through early trauma without internalizing the idea that disaster can strike suddenly, without warning, and without mercy. And that internal reality has shaped his choices in ways the public doesn't always see. His obsession with security, his mistrust of institutions, his urgency to control his environment. All of it makes sense when you understand the lens he sees the world through. So when this incident occurred, it didn't just threaten physical safety. It threatened psychological equilibrium. And the palace would be acutely aware of that. Which raises another uncomfortable question. Did the palace hesitate not because it lacked information, but because it feared the emotional consequences of speaking? Because every word spoken about Harry carries more than meaning. It carries memory. Say too much, and you reopen wounds. Say too little, and you look indifferent. There is no perfect balance. And the palace has never been good at handling emotion publicly. It's built for ceremony, not trauma. Protocol, not grief. Which is why these moments are so revealing. They expose the limits of the institution. Now let's look at the public's reaction more closely. Why did people jump so quickly to worst-case scenarios? Why did fear outpace facts? Because fear is already there, waiting. The association is preloaded. And in media psychology, that's known as priming. Once a certain connection is established in public consciousness, it doesn't need reinforcement. It activates automatically. That's what happened here. The moment people saw his name next to those words, their minds filled in the gaps. And the palace knew that would happen. So again, we have to ask, why speak anyway? Because perhaps the palace understood something the public didn't yet. Perhaps they knew that speculation would be worse than confirmation, that letting imagination run unchecked would cause more harm than acknowledging reality. Or perhaps they knew that more information was about to surface, information that would force the public to confront uncomfortable truths. Now let's address something else. Prince Harry's story has always been a mirror. People project onto him what they think about the monarchy, about privilege, about pain, about escape. To some, he's a victim. To others, he's irresponsible. To others still, he's a cautionary tale. So when something happens to him, reactions say as much about the audience as they do about the event. Some responses are sympathetic. Others are judgmental. Some ask whether his choices put him at risk. Others insist no one deserves that kind of scrutiny. All of those reactions are colliding right now, and the palace is watching carefully. Because how the public frames this moment will influence how the institution responds next. If sympathy dominates, the palace may lean into compassion. If blame dominates, it may retreat into formality. And that decision matters, because it will shape the next chapter of this story. Now here's a detail that hasn't been discussed enough. Prince Harry's relationship with danger has always been paradoxical. On one hand, he seeks control, security, predictability. On the other, he has repeatedly put himself in environments that carry risk: military service, public confrontation, high-stakes media battles. Some see that as recklessness. Others see it as defiance. But there's another interpretation. It's familiarity. When you grow up around trauma, danger feels normal. You don't seek it consciously, but you're not surprised when it appears. That doesn't mean you want it. It means you recognize it. And that recognition shapes how you respond. So when this incident occurred, Harry wasn't just dealing with the present. He was confronting echoes of the past. And the palace knew that, which makes their careful, restrained language even more telling. They weren't just managing a crisis. They were managing a psychological minefield. Now let's turn this back to the institution itself. For all its power, the monarchy has always struggled with one thing: vulnerability. It doesn't know how to talk about it without losing authority. And Harry's entire public journey has been an exercise in exposing vulnerability. That tension has never been resolved. So every time something happens to him, it reopens the same debate. Does the institution protect, or does it preserve itself? Does it prioritize people, or perception? Those questions don't have easy answers. But they are unavoidable now. Because this incident didn't just happen to Harry. It happened to the narrative surrounding him. It challenged the idea that distance equals safety. It challenged the belief that stepping away neutralizes risk. And it challenged the palace's long-standing strategy of controlled silence. Now consider this. If this incident had involved another royal, the response would likely have been different. More reassuring, more structured, more familiar. But Harry occupies a liminal space. Not fully inside, not fully outside. Which means every response involving him has to be invented in real time. An invention under pressure leads to mistakes. That's why the palace moved cautiously. Why they avoided details. Why they chose confirmation over explanation. They're buying time. Time to decide how to frame Harry's place in this story. Time to decide how much responsibility to assume. Time to decide how much emotion to allow. But time is the one thing they may not have. Because public memory doesn't wait. Media cycles don't pause. And emotional narratives spread faster than facts. So as we sit here now, one thing is clear. This story isn't just about what happened on a road. It's about what happened years ago. It's about a boy who walked behind a coffin while the world watched. It's about an institution that never fully learned how to protect him. And it's about whether anything has really changed. Because if this moment teaches us anything, it's that the past is never past. It waits. It listens. And when it sees an opening, it rushes back in. Which brings us to the next question. If the shadow of the past is shaping every reaction now, what happens when new details force the public to confront not just memory, but responsibility? Because once responsibility enters the conversation, this story stops being emotional and starts being dangerous. What if the most dangerous part of this story isn't what happened, but who might be blamed for it? Because that's where the conversation is heading now. Slowly at first, quietly, almost politely. But Benet, that argument exists, but it collides with another powerful idea. That no one chooses vulnerability. That security isn't a luxury. It's a necessity shaped by circumstance, not preference. And Prince Harry's circumstances are unique. His visibility, his history, his symbolism, those factors don't vanish because of a legal status change, which is why this debate never really ended. It just went quiet. Until now. This incident threatens to drag it back into the open. And that's dangerous for the palace. Because public debates don't stay theoretical when real-world events intervene. They become personal. They become emotional. They become urgent. And urgency forces answers. Now consider the timing again. Why did this happen now, when so many unresolved questions already exist? There's a cruel irony here. Prince Harry sought distance to reduce risk. And yet, distance may have complicated protection. That irony is already being whispered about, not shouted. Whispered. And whispered narratives are often more powerful than loud ones. Because they feel organic, unforced. They grow quietly until suddenly everyone is repeating them. Now imagine those whispers turning into headlines. Imagine the framing. Could this have been prevented? Did security gaps play a role? Who was responsible for protection? Those are the headlines the palace fears. Not because they imply guilt, but because they imply obligation. And obligation is the one thing the institution has been trying to redefine for years. Now here's where the internal tension sharpens. If the palace stays silent too long, critics will say it's avoiding accountability. If it speaks too much, it risks saying something that can be used later. So they're waiting. Waiting for stabilization. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for the emotional temperature to settle. But public emotion doesn't settle on command. It escalates. Especially when fueled by memory. And memory, in this case, is merciless. Now let's turn to Prince Harry himself again. Because his voice matters here. Historically, he hasn't stayed quiet when he feels misrepresented. He has spoken openly about fear, trauma, and the cost of being unprotected. If he chooses to speak again after this incident, everything changes. Because personal testimony cuts through institutional language like a blade. One emotional statement could undo months of careful positioning. And the palace knows that, which is why this moment is so fragile. They're not just managing media. They're managing a relationship. A strained one, a public one, and one that has never truly healed. This is why responsibility is such a dangerous word right now. It doesn't just imply blame. It implies unfinished business. It implies that decisions made years ago are still having consequences today. And institutions hate nothing more than delayed consequences, because they can't be easily contained. Now ask yourself this. If new details emerge that suggest systemic failure, not individual error, what happens next? Legal questions arise. Political pressure builds. Public trust erodes further. And suddenly, this is no longer about one incident. It's about governance. That's the nightmare scenario for the palace. Because governance failures don't disappear with statements. They demand reform. Explanation. Apology. And historically, the monarchy has struggled with all three. So as this story continues to unfold, understand this. The real battle isn't over facts yet. It's over framing. Over who is seen as vulnerable. Over who is seen as responsible. Over whether this moment reinforces the idea that the institution protects its own or abandons them when they no longer serve a role. That's the narrative battlefield now. And it's shifting fast. Because once responsibility enters the public conversation, neutrality becomes impossible. People will choose sides. They always do. And when that happens, this story stops being about an accident and becomes about accountability. Which brings us to the next, even more unsettling question. If accountability is coming, who, exactly, is prepared to face it? What if the people asking the questions aren't the public at all, but insiders? Because that's the shift happening now. Quietly. Behind closed doors. Away from cameras and comment sections. The kind of shift you don't see until it's already reshaped the outcome. Up until this point, everything has been external. Media pressure, public emotion, online speculation. But there's another layer to this story, and it's far more dangerous for the palace. Internal scrutiny. When something like this happens, institutions don't just look outward. They look inward. They replay decisions. They audit assumptions. They ask questions that never make it into official statements. Questions like, did we miss something? Did we underestimate risk? Did we assume distance equaled insulation? And once those questions start circulating internally, they don't stop easily. This is where cracks form. Because institutions like the monarchy survive on consensus, on shared belief in the correctness of past decisions, on the idea that even controversial choices were ultimately justified. But incidents have a way of challenging that belief. They force people to revisit old arguments that were never fully resolved, only overridden. Now think about how many decisions involving Prince Harry were made under tension. Security arrangements, protocol changes, responsibility boundaries, risk assessments. None of those were neutral. All of them were debated, and not everyone agreed. So when something goes wrong, those disagreements resurface, not as blame, not as accusation, but as quiet doubt. And doubt inside an institution is far more destabilizing than criticism from outside, because doubt spreads where loyalty once lived. Let's imagine the scene. Officials reviewing timelines, advisors revisiting memos, security experts asking whether assumptions still hold, not because they expect public accountability tomorrow, but because they know something else is coming. Inquiries, not necessarily official ones, but internal reviews, parliamentary questions, media investigations that dig deeper than headlines. And once those begin, everything that was once settled becomes provisional again. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Prince Harry has always been a stress test for the institution, not because of who he is, but because of what he represents. He represents the cost of tradition, the limits of protocol, the human toll of public life. And institutions don't like mirrors. They prefer monuments. So when Harry stepped away, many within the system saw it as closure. A problem resolved. A chapter ended. But moments like this prove something else. That you can't close a chapter when the story is still being written. Distance didn't end responsibility. It complicated it. And that complication is now landing on desks that thought they'd moved on. Which brings us to the most sensitive issue of all. Precedent. Institutions fear precedent more than scandal. Because scandal fades. Precedent lasts. If this incident leads to even a suggestion that previous decisions need revisiting, it opens doors no one wants open. Doors to renegotiation. Doors to redefinition. Doors to accountability frameworks that were never designed for this kind of liminal figure. Prince Harry is not a working royal, but he is not just a private citizen. That contradiction has always been managed through ambiguity. Ambiguity is useful until it's tested. This is the test. Now ask yourself something. If internal voices begin to question whether ambiguity has gone too far, what happens next? Because once internal consensus fractures, external messaging becomes fragile. You can see it in subtle ways. Statements get shorter. Language becomes more cautious. Silence stretches longer between updates. That's not confidence. That's recalibration. And recalibration usually means someone, somewhere, is reconsidering past choices. Now let's talk about another layer that rarely gets discussed publicly. Risk tolerance. Every institution operates on an implicit level of acceptable risk. It decides what level of danger is tolerable in exchange for autonomy, optics, or efficiency. Prince Harry's departure required a recalculation of that tolerance. How much risk is acceptable when someone chooses independence? How much support is justified? Where does duty end and choice begin? Those questions were answered once, but answers given in theory don't always survive reality. An incident like this forces a reevaluation, because what seemed acceptable on paper can feel reckless in hindsight, and hindsight is merciless. Now imagine being an advisor who once argued for stricter boundaries, or someone who warned that reduced involvement might have unintended consequences, or someone who pushed for compromise and was overruled. Moments like this validate doubts. And validation is powerful. It emboldens voices that were once quiet. Which is why internal debate is likely intensifying now. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. And that matters more than any headline. Because institutions change from the inside out, not the outside in. Now let's consider how this intersects with public trust. The monarchy relies on the perception of wisdom. That decisions are made carefully, thoughtfully, with foresight. If internal reassessment leaks into public view, that perception cracks. Not because mistakes were made, but because it suggests uncertainty at the core. And uncertainty is contagious. That's why the palace is being so careful now. Every word weighed, every pause deliberate, every silence strategic. They're not just responding to an incident. They're protecting the idea that they know what they're doing. Now here's where things get even more delicate. Internal questioning doesn't stay internal forever. It leaks through off-the-record briefings, through sources close to the situation, through subtle shifts in tone from usually aligned commentators. And when those leaks begin, they change the narrative again. The story stops being about what happened. It becomes about whether it should have happened. And that's a far more dangerous conversation. Because once should enters the discussion, morality and judgment follow. Now think about the broader implications. If this incident sparks a serious internal review of how Prince Harry's status has been handled, it could affect more than just him. It could reshape how the institution deals with anyone who steps outside traditional roles. It could force clearer definitions, clearer boundaries, clearer responsibilities. And clarity is exactly what the palace has avoided. Because clarity limits flexibility. But flexibility is useless when ambiguity creates risk. This is the crossroads. Now let's bring the focus back to timing one more time. Why now? Why did this incident occur at a moment when institutional tensions were already unresolved? Some would call it coincidence. Others would call it inevitability. When systems operate under unresolved strain, stress events expose weaknesses. Not because they're malicious, but because they're revealing. And this incident is revealing something important. That the story of Prince Harry and the monarchy is not finished. Not emotionally, not institutionally, not narratively. And every attempt to treat it as resolved has been premature. Now consider the next move. If internal scrutiny deepens, the palace may face a choice. Double down on distance, or reassert involvement. Each option carries risk. Distance could be seen as abandonment. Involvement could be seen as admission. There is no path without consequence. Which is why the silence feels so heavy now. It's not empty. It's full of deliberation. And deliberation under pressure rarely produces clean outcomes. Now here's the question that matters most going forward. What happens if internal conclusions don't align with public expectations? If advisors decide one thing, but the public demands another? If protecting the institution conflicts with protecting a person? Those conflicts don't resolve quietly. They erupt. And eruptions are what change history. This is why this moment feels so tense. Because it's not just about waiting for details of an incident. It's about waiting to see whether the institution chooses self-preservation or adaptation. And that choice will echo far beyond this story. Because Prince Harry has always been more than one person in the eyes of the world. He's been a symbol of change, a warning, a challenge, and now, possibly, a catalyst. If this incident forces the palace to confront unresolved questions it has avoided for years, the consequences will be profound. Not immediate, but lasting. Because institutions don't fracture overnight. They fracture decision by decision, silence by silence, choice by choice. And right now, every choice feels heavier than usual. Because everyone involved knows one thing. This isn't just about what happened. It's about what it reveals. And revelations have a way of changing everything. Which brings us to the next question. If internal scrutiny turns into internal disagreement, who will break first? Who breaks first when silence becomes unbearable? That's the question tightening its grip now. Because silence, at this stage, is no longer neutral. It's active. It's pressing on nerves. It's forcing people to choose between loyalty and self-preservation. And history shows us that when institutions go quiet under pressure, someone always fills the void. Sometimes it's an aide. Sometimes it's a source. Sometimes it's a voice the palace thought it had already lost. And that's what makes this phase so volatile. Up to now, the palace has relied on discipline, on collective restraint, on the belief that everyone inside understands the stakes and will hold the line. That belief usually holds, until it doesn't. Because silence is hardest on the people who know the most. Think about it. Those closest to the situation are sitting on information. Not gossip, not rumor. Details, context, nuance. The kind of information that explains why decisions were made the way they were. The kind that could calm the public or inflame it. And they're being asked not to share any of it. For how long? That's the problem. There is no timeline. When silence has an endpoint, people can endure it. When it stretches indefinitely, cracks form. And cracks spread. This is where the danger shifts from external pressure to internal strain. Because institutions don't collapse from outside attacks. They fracture from inside fatigue. Now consider the people who occupy the most precarious positions. Communications staff tasked with defending a narrative they didn't fully design. Security advisors whose past recommendations are being silently re-examined. Senior aides balancing duty to the crown with personal conscience. These are not abstract roles. These are individuals with careers, reputations, and futures on the line. And when uncertainty threatens those things, loyalty becomes conditional, not out of malice, out of survival. Now ask yourself this. What happens if someone inside decides that silence is hurting them more than speaking would? That calculation changes everything. Because leaks don't usually start with betrayal. They start with justification. I'm just providing context. I'm correcting misinformation. I'm protecting the truth. Those are the stories people tell themselves before they talk. And once one voice speaks, others follow. Not all at once, but enough to change the narrative. That's the tipping point the palace fears. Because once the narrative fragments, control evaporates. Now let's examine why this risk is especially acute right now. The incident itself created emotional shock. The confirmation created expectation. The silence created tension. That combination is combustible. Audiences are primed for revelation. Media outlets are hungry for angles beyond the obvious. And insiders know that their version of events could shape how history remembers this moment. That's a powerful temptation. Now layer in another factor. The passage of time. Every hour without clarification doesn't just maintain suspense. It invites reinterpretation. Headlines grow more speculative. Commentary becomes more pointed. Questions become accusations. Silence stops feeling responsible and starts feeling evasive. And when that shift happens, people inside the system feel it too. They see the narrative turning. They see reputations being subtly reshaped. And they begin to ask themselves a hard question. Am I willing to be remembered as complicit in silence? That question is dangerous. Because once people frame silence as complicity, speaking becomes a moral act. And moral acts are harder to suppress than strategic ones. Now consider the role of personal loyalty. Loyalty to the institution is powerful, but it competes with other loyalties. Loyalty to truth. Loyalty to conscience. Loyalty to individuals caught in the storm. Prince Harry has allies. Quiet ones. People who watch decisions unfold. People who worried about outcomes long before this incident occurred. Those people are feeling vindicated right now. Vindication loosens tongues. Because it reframes past disagreements as foresight. And foresight deserves recognition. Now let's talk about timing again. Why hasn't anyone broken yet? Because the palace still holds leverage. Access. Status. Future opportunities. Those things matter. But leverage weakens with time. As public narratives harden, the value of speaking early increases. Early voices define context. Late voices sound defensive. So anyone considering breaking silence knows this. If they're going to speak, they'll want to do it before the story calcifies. That clock is ticking. Now imagine being inside the palace and knowing that. Knowing that every passing day increases the risk of an uncontrolled disclosure. What do? You tighten discipline. You issue reminders. You reinforce protocols. But reinforcement can feel like pressure. And pressure breeds resentment. Resentment breeds leaks. This is the paradox of crisis management. The more you try to control information, the more valuable it becomes. And valuable information doesn't stay contained forever. Now let's examine the palace's greatest vulnerability. It relies on discretion as a cultural norm, not a legal one. Discretion is enforced through expectation, not punishment. Through shared belief, not coercion. That works beautifully in stable times. In crisis, it's fragile. Because crises expose differences in belief. Some believe protecting the institution is paramount. Others believe protecting people is. And when those beliefs diverge, silence fractures. Now consider how this intersects with public trust. If a leak emerges that contradicts or complicates the palace's position, trust erodes quickly. Not because the leak is necessarily accurate, but because it suggests internal disagreement. And disagreement undermines authority. That's why the palace is desperate to avoid even the appearance of fracture. But appearances are already shifting. The longer the silence continues, the more people assume something is being withheld. That assumption becomes belief. Belief becomes narrative. And narrative becomes reality. Now think about the next possible trigger. What if an external body releases information? Police reports, medical updates, witness statements. Those are outside the palace's control. If they surface before the palace SP